guys, this is Confined to the Sky. Tonight I'm going to share with you something a little bit more personal. A couple of years ago I had a pretty distressing and disturbing dream that was about sin in my life. And so if you're someone who is maybe a little bit more sensitive, you might not want to watch this video. But it was probably more disturbing to me because I was actually in the dream itself, and it's probably more disturbing that way than me just conveying it and relaying it to you. So the circumstance around this dream in my life, I think everything was going relatively normal, and I just happened one evening to fall asleep next to the wood stove, and so my husband went to bed on his own. And so as I was laying there on the couch, I had this dream. So in this dream, I found myself at the darkest time of night in a graveyard. And just outside of the fence of the graveyard, there was this grassed area, and my kids were sound asleep right there. I found myself running among the tombstones, very frantically looking for a specific tombstone. And I eventually found it, and so I knelt down at the grave, and I was starting to cry and lament and mourn over this grave. Now, this grave, this person who was in this grave, it represented a sin in my life. And so I was there lamenting and mourning about this sin that was no longer present. It was no longer alive. It was dead and had been buried, but I was still mourning the loss of that sin. Now I looked up while I was still kneeling at this grave, and I saw another person walking around next to the cemetery, and that other person represented another sin in my life. Now, from kneeling at this grave, I stood up and I just kind of was looking around and realizing I'm in a cemetery in the middle of the night. And so I was kind of looking over where I was in this cemetery, and my eyes came to rest on another grave that was also kind of near me. And I saw that the body was actually not buried yet, but someone had just placed this body on top of the ground in that spot. And this body was in the process of full-on decay. So, rigor mortis had already set in, and it was changing color, and I won't go into full detail. It was like the worst thing I have never seen before. And what was even more distressing was that I started realizing that this body was trying and attempting to come back to life. And so it was actually twitching, and I could see that it wasn't just a twitch, but it was trying to come back to life. And as I was looking at this horrid thing that was taking place, I started to become a little bit more aware that my children were with me there in the cemetery area, and they were just kind of sleeping on some grass, unaware as to what was going on, and also unaware of what I had brought them into. So at this point, I quickly woke up, and I was really disturbed by this dream, really disturbed. Do you remember that feeling when you were really young and you might have had a bit of a nightmare and you woke up and you wanted to crawl in bed with your mom and dad and just kind of pull the covers over? That was me. And I basically crawled into bed next to my husband, and I was like, oh my goodness, that's what I did. I was so distressed. And so just reflecting on that, I even knew, even as I was sitting there, I was I knew it was about sin in my life. Now, the first grave that I was at, it was about a sin that I had buried. I definitely been turning from, not going back to over and over. If I am tempted with that again, I am constantly trying to keep that buried. Yet I found myself there mourning that I no longer could, have this sin in my life. And so that's definitely something I just knew that I needed to just walk away from. Now, the sin that was representative of the person walking around, I know that was unconfessed sin in my life, and so that's something I was needing to confess and bring into the light. Now, the last part where there was that body that had not yet been buried but was attempting to come back to life, I believe that this represents sin in our life that we have not buried. And so if we actually have not buried it, it is going to keep trying to attempt to resurrect again in our life. And seeing the look of the condition of that body, I got a real clear image of how putrid our sin is to God. And I realized that as parents, if we aren't dealing with known sin in our lives, that we are even unintentionally kind of bringing our children next to this area or kind of in this place or atmosphere of spiritual death and darkness, even if they are completely unaware as to where they are. I share this dream with you because I want you to also be aware of how serious sin is in your life. And maybe there's something like me that you had buried, but you haven't actually left that cemetery yet. And it's time to do that. Maybe you have an unconfessed sin. It's time to confess that sin. Obviously, first God. Maybe it's also you need to be confessing it to another person in your life. And lastly, is there a sin in your life that isn't necessarily alive and unconfessed, but isn't actually buried yet? This is something that needs to be done because it is so disturbing and putrid when that sin is still trying to resurrect over and over again, and you haven't taken that time to actually bury it and cut it off from the land of the living. All right, thank you for watching. Take care, and God bless.